Hello, everyone, and welcome to COMM 101 Online. It's me, Sam, here to teach you Chapter 7, Connecting Listening and Thinking in the Communication Process. Let's get started. We're going to start with hearing versus listening because these are two very separate processes. First is hearing, which is the passive psychological process, so the sound being received by the ear. Basically, that's it. That's hearing, the actual process of it being done. While listening is the active and cognitive process, and it requires energy, desire, focus, and attention to listen. So actually hearing what someone is saying rather than just going through the process of hearing noise. You're taking that noise and translating it to meaning. So these are the differences between hearing and listening. The Hartford cognitive listening model states that listening is both a cognitive and relational model and process. So it's primarily a cognitive function, meaning that we are processing information in the brain. When we hear noise, we are then creating meaning and processing it through the brain to understand that meaning, which is the listening aspect. It is also relational, meaning this is a major aspect to interaction in relationships. So listening and thinking about the meaning of what the other person is trying to say rather than just hearing the noise. This also identifies what affects us while listening. So we have our internal filters, which is going to filter through information that we are receiving to decide whether or not we like something, don't like something, and how we feel about what is being said. And it's also going to affect our behavioral skills, so how we react to what is being said. And again, this is going to be tied to listening rather than just hearing, because listening is actually processing what is being said. Now here is a very complicated looking model. It shows that our internal filters include educational influence, ego and attitudes, previous experiences, values, and cultures. So what we are kind of going in with and how we translate messages based on our past experiences. And it shows here that all these internal filters are going to impact how we interpret, understand, and evaluate messages, which we assess through our behavioral skills of sense-making, thinking preferences, focus and attention, and remembering. Sensing can include hearing, so sound being received by the ear, that noise. Accurate hearing requires the listener to concentrate on the speaker and discriminate among sounds, so picking through what is supposed to be said and maybe differentiating between background noise or interruptions. The listener takes in information through the senses. So we rely on hearing or sight or other senses to be able to communicate so we can then interpret those messages. And information is processed in the brain. So how we receive communication is through our senses, and then it is interpreted through the brain to determine what those senses picked up in terms of communication. Information processing, evaluation, interpretation, and understanding are all very important aspects when it comes to listening effectively. Information processing is assigning meaning to the stimuli you sense. So again, using our senses, we are then interpreting the messages through our brain and assigning meaning to that stimuli. So the evaluation is assessing meaning of information because there's quite a lot to evaluate so we can assess that meaning. And again, it's going to go back to our past experiences. Everyone's going to have a different evaluation process to be able to interpret messages. That's another reason why communication is so unique, because not only are the moments of communicating unique and hard to replicate, but how it is determined and understood, evaluated, is going to be unique depending on each person and their experiences. Interpretation is explaining meaning of the information. So this can be done by interpreting it yourself or asking for the interpretation from another person. And understanding is knowing meaning out of the information in our minds. So coming in with background information, being able to interpret it, understanding what is being said or what is being communicated. A large aspect of listening is the sense to remember. In a lot of relationships, there's those arguments of, oh, you're hearing me, but you're not actually listening, because listening comes with a cognitive process. And remembering information, especially when it comes to like interpersonal relationships, is going to be tied to listening rather than hearing. Remembering is recalling something from stored memory, and it works with memory and long-term memory to form this essential process. And what we remember when it comes to other people and experiences is going to be based on whether or not we were actually listening, because that memory is going to be stored based on the information that we remember, that we actually put through the process of interpreting and understanding. Selective perception and selective attention can cause a loss of information. So interest or lack of interest in a conversation or a moment in time where communication is happening can affect whether or not you're going to listen, which then affects whether or not you're going to remember and be able to access that information later on. And this is the whole brain model, and it's a figure that depicts the 4 quadrants of the brain and identifies the type of thinking that occurs in each quadrant. So a lot of us can take a look at this and kind of figure out what kind of thinker or listener that we are. To the upper left, we have the logical, analytical, fact-based, and quantitative. So someone might be more interested in fact-based or be able to listen more effectively or remember things more effectively if they're fact-based. Lower left, we have organized, sequential, planned, and detailed. The upper right, we have holistic, intuitive, integrating, synthesizing. Bottom right, we have interpersonal, feeling-based, kinesthetic, emotional. So what we're seeing here is the right side of the brain maybe is a little bit more sensitive and emotional, more empathetic and into feeling, while the left side is going to be more logical, analytical, fact-based. And it's interesting to look at this because we can see when different parts of the brain are being utilized that there's going to be different effects that come with that, including how we are going to listen, how we're going to interpret information, and how we're going to be able to carry on a conversation and how it might impact our interpersonal relationships. There are 2 main parts of interpretation. First is taking into account total communication context, so you are able to understand the meaning of what is said, so your environment, who you're talking to, and then also letting the speaker know you understand the message. So that give and take, the encoding and decoding, the transactional model, there needs to be communication going back and forth to be able to come up with clear interpretation to make sure that the communication being stated or being experienced is being understood to the best of its ability. The specific situation and nonverbal aspects are also important to consider because, as we have talked about before, nonverbals can completely sway how a message is being interpreted or being given. Evaluating includes the listener analyzing evidence, so communication, so sorting fact from opinion. How this evaluation and sorting fact from opinion is important to understand as well. So is it fact checking, like looking up sources, talking with other people, really focusing on that interpretation aspect, so making sure clarification's happening. This helps determine the intent of the speaker. Is there a bias that needs to be aware of? Judges accuracy of speakers' statements. So is this someone who is trustworthy? And judges the accuracy of one's own personal conclusions. So kind of going back to that bias or that fundamental attribution error. How is evaluating information from another person being affected by your own forms of interpretation, evaluation, and listening? Responding and sending feedback. So first we have responding. The overt behavior of the listener indicates to speaker what has and has not been received. So instead of just hearing noise, you are listening, you are processing the information so you can respond and show that you are also taking the time to listen and interpret the information that's being said so a conversation can happen. Feedback helps to ensure the understanding and helps the speaker determine the success of communication or whether or not something needs to be clarified. And be aware of pseudo-listening. So it's kind of that default stance where you think you're listening, that you're processing information, but you're not doing it to the full capacity. So you're not really focusing on the evaluation or the interpretation. It's just enough so you can get through a conversation. Responding and sending feedback is really important when it comes to interpersonal communication or any communication where you're trying to have a conversation or give information or receive information. So what's really important here is working memory. So you can remember what is being said, what has been said, so you can incorporate that into the communication you're experiencing at the moment. So first we have categorization. So putting memories in boxes in your head. So you experience something and you tell yourself, hey, I've experienced something very similar to that in the past. So I am going to put this memory next to this other memory because they're similar. I'm going to categorize these experiences next to each other in hopes that I remember them better. Then we have meditation, which is really kind of taking care of the physiological and the psychological. So stress, sleep, actually giving your memory the tools and resources it needs to be able to work. Then you have imagery, so tying a memory to an image. There's this one experience I have, it involves the show Phil of the Future. There was this one time, I think I was like 14. My mom gave me some multivitamins. They're like the dinosaur ones from Costco that like explode chalk in your mouth. Anyway, I was watching this specific episode of Phil of the Future and I was taking those multivitamins. And then after that, every time I saw that episode, I all of a sudden was just bombarded by the taste and smell of those vitamins. Anyway, long story short, tying imagery to an experience or moment of time can really help trigger a memory and allow that to be used in communication. And then you have mnemonics, which is going to be something like Roy G. Biv, which is a tool used to remember the colors of the rainbow. So we have red, orange, yellow. Roy G is green. And then we have Biv, which is blue, indigo, violet. So tying in something like this anagram, I think that's what it's called, to be able to remember something because you're shortening it, but still tying meaning to each letter, to each abbreviation. These are all tools that we use, sometimes even subconsciously, for our working memory to be able to help with interpersonal relationships, help with listening, and helping with communication. There are several ways that we use listening to function. One of them is listening to obtain information. So listening to gain comprehension. Now, these are very conscious acts. So listening to obtain information, you are specifically trying to learn something. You are trying to understand something. So you are taking the time to listen, to take in the meaning, to evaluate and to interpret, and then come up with your own conclusions, maybe learn something new, and then you can take that and go forth. Then we have listening to evaluate, which is listening to judge or analyze information. Again, there is a specific purpose to you listening. You are trying to analyze information or maybe judge or come up with what the speaker is trying to accomplish, who they are. Is there a bias? You have a specific role and you are trying to meet that goal through listening. Then we have listening with empathy. So we've talked about empathy before, but empathy is the intellectual identification with or vicarious experiences of feelings, thoughts, attitudes of others. And empathetic listening is listening to understand what another person is thinking and feeling. And these are tools really used in interpersonal communication. It's a way to be able to connect with someone, to show that you are understanding, to show that you care about the situation so the communication can continue and be meaningful. This is a tool used to reflect and clarify feelings, to make sure intent and needs are being understood so they can then be met. Then we have listening for enjoyment. So this is purely for pleasure, satisfaction, and appreciation. So think of when you listen to music or you are watching a television show. The intent may not be to learn or evaluate. It may just be for pleasure, but there's still this thinking process going on. Because if we think about it a little bit more, to be able to experience the pleasure or the enjoyment from listening to something that we want to enjoy, we have to go through that process. We have to interpret and evaluate the messages to be able to enjoy it. We have all these different intents when it comes to listening, either learning, evaluation, enjoyment, and it's all going to depend on how we interpret that information. What is our intent when we are listening to this communication that is happening? And then we have some barriers to effective listening. So first, we're going to talk about preferred thinking. This is really tied to bias and prejudices. So we have trouble listening to messages or people whom we are biased against. And this can go from a huge spectrum of something that might be harmful to not harmful to somewhere in between. But it is important to understand how our bias and prejudices are going to affect how we listen. So again, hearing is not what we're talking about. We can all hear messages, but listening, how we are going to comprehend that message. Are we going to do anything with that information? That can be affected by bias and prejudice. What we're going to do with the communication that we've been given. Is it going to impact us doing something or not doing something? This can also lead us to avoiding difficult listening situations. So if we see someone who is speaking and we don't like what they stand for, or we know something about them that we don't agree with, we may avoid listening to what they have to say, which can impact meaningful, useful communication. Now, this is something that we all can struggle with. It's something I still deal with and am trying to work on, is listening to people that I don't agree with. But it's something that you really have to be cognitive of and have actual intent to change about yourself. It is difficult to want to listen to someone that you deep down think is wrong, but there are situations where it can be useful, where it can be positive or benefit or eye-opening. I'm not going to say that it's every situation that you should listen to people that you don't agree with or are speaking about something that is harmful and saying that you should agree with it. Not at all. But being aware is like the first step. So being aware of your bias and prejudices and what may impact you listening. Because if you're aware of something, then you can take that next step and decide whether or not you're going to do something to change it or stay the same way. Then we have critical listening and thinking. So critical listening is the judging accuracy of information. It determines the reasonableness of conclusions and evaluates the presenter. So instead of just being a passive listener, just taking in the information, you are taking the time to understand what's being said. Why is it being said? Asking those questions. Is it something that is reasonable? Does it make sense? Is enough information presented? Critical thinking and critical listening are both very important aspects, and it's something that Boise State and most universities say that they want their students to lead with. Critical listening and critical thinking is really tied to just asking questions about what you're being told instead of just receiving it and accepting it as truth. So critical thinking we have here as the ability to analyze and assess information, and you do that by asking questions and then searching for further information to make the conclusions that you want to make. So that's it for this lecture. Please make sure that you look at the discussion board. It is on Blackboard. It's on the left-hand side. It says discussion board. There will be a question there that you will need to answer in that specific thread. Make sure you are working on your persuasive speech outlines. They are due on Sunday by 11:59 p.m. on Blackboard in the assignment section. When you click assignments on the left-hand side in Blackboard, there is a persuasive speech button, and there will be a place to submit your outline for your persuasive speech. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, if you're struggling with anything, even if it's not tied to classes or schoolwork, please reach out. Let me know. I am here for you. I want to be able to be a resource for you, and I want you to be able to get as much as you can out of this class, even with the situation that we're in. So I hope you are all doing very well. Again, please reach out if you need to. And make sure you're taking time to be able to take care of yourself emotionally, physically, do some self-care. I will talk to you all in the next lecture, and remember that communication is always happening and always has meaning.